like a swarm of locusts, a havoc in Wyoming. Short story by Millie Copper.
Norm Russell stood on his front porch, watching the two young women disappear into the morning haze that hung over the pasture. The golden Wyoming sunlight burned through the mist, lighting wild grass and casting shadows. Waving, the smaller one, Sabrina, kept looking back at the farmhouse. Sylvia, the older one, hadn't turned around once.
"Those girls are going to have a hard time of it,"
Peg said, stepping up beside him with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Norm accepted his cup and took a long sip. "Yep, city girls. Probably never walked more than a few blocks in their lives." He watched as they reached the fence line and began picking their way through the barbed wire. "Now they're in cow pie territory and act like it's a quaint vacation." Peg tapped his shoulder. Come on, Norm. They're doing fine." "Should have stayed put wherever they came from." "Don't say that. You watched the cities on television, same as I did, before the cyber attack began. Some of those places were no longer fit for man or beast. And that was before the lights and phones stopped working. The internet. Can you imagine what it's like now?" She tutted and shook her head. A lock of gray slipped from her bun, and she brushed it back without losing stride in her thoughts. "You wouldn't wish that on those sweet girls." He glanced sideways at his wife. Peg wore her hair in its usual style, piled on top with bangs flat across her forehead, but it was her eyes that caught him. That look meant she was fixing to get involved in something. "I mean it plenty. This whole mess started because folks didn't stay where they belonged. This mess started because some terrorists did what they do best, cause destruction without a second thought for who gets caught in it. Those young girls want to get home, be with their mom. I would hope our children would want the same thing if we had any." He rested his hand on her shoulder. They'd always assumed they'd have kids. When it didn't happen right away, they never worried. Eventually, they'd gone to a doctor, asked what the problem was, but nothing was ever determined, not for certain anyway. The doctor had suggested extra tests and specialists, but they couldn't bring themselves to keep chasing something that felt further away each time. Peg sipped her coffee and watched the sisters until there were specks moving across the vast Wyoming landscape. "I need to get some things together." "What for?" "The Grange Hall. We're meeting at 11 to get things put together. Folks will show up for food around noon." Norm rolled his eyes so hard it almost gave him a headache. "Fine. But I still think you and your friends are jumping to conclusions. This is Wyoming. Folks are aware of how to look after themselves. People like those sisters are the ones facing the real difficulty. Travelers." Peg turned to face him, her gray eyes flashing. "This is Wyoming, and people know how to take care of themselves. But we also take care of each other. Always have." Norm grunted and took another sip of coffee. He had lost this argument before it had even started. Nothing new there. Peg got a bee in her bonnet, and there's no reasoning with her, no convincing her to see his side of things. He didn't want to admit it, but frequently she was correct. And he cooperated with her, complaining merely to preserve a front, not because he desired to disagree with her. "I need half an hour to finish the morning chores. I can go without you." "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. He softened his tone. He shifted his weight on the wooden porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots. "If you insist on leaving the farm, I'm going along to keep you safe." Peg patted her hip, where the outline of her .40 caliber Springfield showed beneath her cotton blouse. "I can keep myself safe, thank you very much." "I know you can, but I'm still coming." She smiled, the same smile that had made his heart leap when they were 17, and still stirred him over 50 years later. "I'll get everything ready while you finish up," Peg said. 45 minutes later, Norm backed his father's old pickup out of the barn. The 1977 F-150 had been the first truck his dad had ever bought new, having saved up for years to afford it. Norm had kept it running long after most folks would have traded it in, though it looked far from cherry now. Rust spots bloomed along the reel wells, and the blue paint had faded to the color of old denim. A crack in the windshield split the passenger side, and the tailgate had to be lifted just right.
He carried Peg's soup pot to the truck and lifted the lid to peek inside. Vegetable beef soup, thick with carrots and potatoes from their root cellar. Made from last year's garden bounty. The vegetables had shriveled and lost their best quality, but they had planned the garden to carry them through until this year's harvest. Now, he wasn't sure how that would work. The garden, which was Peg's pride and joy, was intended for 2 people. Yet here she was, sharing what they had left with the neighbors.
He stared at the soup a second longer than he meant to, steam fogging his glasses as he wrestled with his thoughts. That familiar knot of worry coiled in his belly tight, unrelenting. It was not only food. It was the idea that nothing was secure anymore. Peg kept giving like the world hadn't changed, like it would reset itself the way a spring blizzard gives way to melt. But Norm had watched too many winters stretch into lean springs to believe in easy fixes. Peg had too, but she seemed to forget how severe things could get. He knew it was the right thing to do, but that didn't make him any less uneasy. He didn't want anyone to go hungry, but the thought of Peg running short on food filled him with dread and kept him awake at night. By day, he said all the right things. He insisted to his wife, and to anyone who would listen, that this was temporary, that the government, as he called them, would set things right. Deep down, he did not believe it. What started as a terrorist attack that had nothing to do with Wyoming, 5 planes shot down in 5 large cities, had turned into something affecting the entire country. Dozens and dozens of bridges also went down after the planes crashed. For reasons Norm would never understand, people in the affected cities left their perfectly suitable homes and fled. If only a few people had done it, it'd be fine. But thousands left the cities, clogging up the interstates and highways, consuming all the gas and food, filling up the hotels, and causing general mayhem. All Norm could figure was they were like sheep, following each other to the slaughter. Like rats off a ship that might not even be sinking yet, he muttered to himself as he shut the tailgate.
The sisters who had camped in his field overnight were much the same as the others, but something set them apart from the ones he'd seen interviewed on TV when the whole mess began. Those people behaved as though the small towns they swarmed owed them a warm welcome.
Sylvia and Sabrina at least carried their own food, and unlike some of the scavengers fleeing the cities, they had somewhere to go, their folks' place near the Montana state line. He'd watched Peg's face, how it softened when she looked at those girls, how her fingers twitched like she wanted to tuck them under her wing. Taking care of people was what she did. It was as natural for her as breathing. She would have made an amazing mom.
How many people you expecting?
He asked as she stepped off the porch. He hurried around the truck, opened her door, and offered his hand.
Hard to say. Maybe 10, maybe 30. Could be more.
Peg climbed into the passenger seat and brushed her jeans at the knees. Depends on who needs help and who only wants to visit. Other folks will bring food too, I imagine.
She adjusted the sun visor and looked at him sideways, her voice soft but pointed.
And perhaps bring news. Norm put the truck in gear and headed down their long gravel driveway. The old Ford's engine had a familiar rumble, comforting in its reliability. The gravel crunched in rhythm beneath the tires. Sagebrush blurred past the windows, and in the distance antelope darted away from the road, their graceful bounds, little reminders that some things still followed natural law.
Still think this is a waste of time. People around here don't need organizing. They need to be left alone to handle their own business.
You're probably right about that, Peg said. But it doesn't hurt to check on folks, especially with all the strangers moving through. Norm's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His field wasn't the only one used by the transients. He heard talk from others. They'd all seen signs. Camps abandoned quickly, and cattle spooked in the night. Most were harmless enough, like the sisters passing through. But eventually there would be trouble. There always was when desperate people had nothing left to lose. "We'll see," he said, but the words rang hollow, even to his own ears. The old Grange Hall sat at the intersection of 2 county roads. The clapboard walls, once white, had weathered to the pale shade of old parchment, and the metal roof creaked with the wind. When the Grange chapter fell apart back in the 80s, The building itself sat empty for years. Norm's mom had been on the committee that formed a non-profit to save the building and put it back into use. Now, it acted as a local community center, sometimes holding dances and potlucks, rented out for small weddings. Cars and trucks filled the gravel parking lot, and Norm recognized most of them. The Miller's white Dodge, the Kowalski's little Honda, Doc's Toyota. He parked the Ford with a lurch, the tires skidding pebbles. A red-tailed hawk screamed overhead, its shadow skimming the windshield before disappearing into a patch of brittle bitterbrush along the fence line. Inside, the smell of coffee and homemade food filled the air. They arranged long tables in the main hall, spread mismatched tablecloths over them, and added covered dishes on top. A hand-stitched banner from the 90s, Fremont County Fair, hung crookedly above the serving line, its faded blue letters proclaiming, "Community Strong." Norm counted 23 people, including the children. Except for the youngsters, everyone carried weapons. People leaned rifles against walls, had pistols on their hips, and strapped shotguns across their shoulders. A common sight even before the trouble, but more pronounced these days. Betty Miller waved them over to a table near the front. Betty had taught second grade for 40 years before retiring, and she still had a way of making grown men feel like they needed to sit up straight. Peg set her soup pot on the serving table before making her way around the room, stopping to speak with everyone, and ask how they were holding up. She had seen most of them the day before, but that didn't matter. Norm grumbled under his breath at the look she gave him, the one that meant be sociable, but deep down he was glad to see the community pulling together. "How are things over your way?" Doc asked as he limped up to Norm. He moved as if everything hurt, and it probably did. The Army medic had served in what he called the sandbox, and had taken shrapnel when an IED went off nearby. After being medically discharged, he settled in the area, unsure of what the future held. Truman Gardner, or Doc, as everyone called him, had made a place for himself among the local farmers and ranchers. He volunteered as an EMT with the fire department, and even received extra training to join Fremont County Search and Rescue, working with both the Riverton and Lander divisions. "Quiet enough. A couple of young women camped in our field last night. Sisters traveling to family up north." "Yep, that's happening all around," said Scott Miller, joining their conversation. "Folks moving through. Most are decent enough, but you never know." Norm nodded. "That's what I'm thinking. Been wondering if we should talk about security. Peg's been worrying some." Doc's face grew serious. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a gravelly murmur. "Already been discussing it with some of the others. Figure we need to organize patrols, set up some kind of communication system." "Radio network," Scott suggested. "Most of us got walkie-talkies. Some have CBs. They don't talk nice with each other, but we could sort something out. Get one of the guys with a ham setup to act as our go-between. Could establish check-in times." Norm considered this. It made sense, much as he hated to admit it. "What about the main roads?" "Block them," Doc suggested with a nod. "Don't need to block them," Scott said. "Simply need to know who's using them. Set up observation posts. Keep watch." More men had drifted over to their group. They spoke in low voices, planning patrol routes and discussing which roads needed watching most carefully. "What about ammunition?" Doc asked. "How's everyone fixed?" "Well enough," Norm said. "But we might want to think about sharing resources if things get bad." "Things are already bad," Scott said quietly. A muscle twitched beneath his left eye. "You can't convince me otherwise. We might not be seeing it here, but we will. Mark my words, we will." The men fell silent. A cold heaviness settled in Norm's stomach. Deep down, he knew Scott was right. Their safety was temporary. One of the bridges that blew was in Denver, only 5 hours away. You'd seen the news reports of people fleeing the Colorado City. The traffic backed up on Interstate 25 from Denver to Cheyenne. The interstate turned north at Casper, but he knew some people would leave it there and head west. West toward Shoshone, and on to Riverton, passing far too close to their little community, so small it barely registered on a map. Someone would discover them. He knew that as surely as he knew anything. They'd been told about the overflowing campgrounds at Boysen Reservoir, only half an hour away. Norm tipped the brim of his hat up from his forehead, pulled it off, and took comfort in its familiar stiffness. The sweatband left a damp ring on his silver hair. He wiped the sweat from his brow with his free hand. The room was growing warmer as more people crowded in. The smell of unwashed bodies, several days without electricity or hot water, without running water for some, thickening the air. The windows stood open, but no breeze came through.
All the more reason to get organized, Doc said finally. He straightened, bones popping audibly. We look out for each other, keep strangers moving along peaceful-like, and hope things settle down before they reach us.
Norm was about to respond when Peg appeared at his elbow. Her fingers brushed his wrist. A light touch, but he felt the calluses from decades of garden work, the slight tremor she'd never admit to.
Norm, honey, would you mind getting a few more chairs to put around the tables? People are getting ready to eat.
He nodded and did his wife's bidding, but his mind stayed on the conversation. Clogged roads, filled campgrounds, armed strangers on the roads. Seemed Peg's community organizing wasn't such a bad idea after all.
The meal was a proper potluck, the kind Norm remembered from his childhood. Plenty of food, technically, but fewer dishes than usual, and that meant something. Times were harder now. Supplies were thinning. Peg's soup pot was nearly empty. A gaunt man with dirt under his fingernails mentioned it was the first time his kids had eaten since yesterday's gathering. Norm tilted his head, studying the man. His wife also looked frail, but at least the two kids seemed healthy enough. He didn't know them, but someone yesterday had said they were renting the old Smitty place. They moved in about a month ago, having moved from somewhere back east.
We'll get together tomorrow, too, Peg told them, her voice warm but firm. And come find me before you leave. I brought a few extra things that'll tide you over. Norm found himself at a table with several other farmers, their wives chatting nearby while children played in the corner under watchful eyes. The conversation stayed light. Weather, crops, local gossip. But Norm could feel the undercurrent of tension, the way people's eyes flicked toward windows, how hands stayed near weapons.
Anyone heard from the Hendersons?
Asked Doc.
Saw smoke from their place yesterday,
Scott replied.
Figured they were burning brush.
Might be worth checking on them, Norm suggested. Their place is pretty isolated. Betty Miller approached their table, moving with the purposeful stride that had once corralled unruly 8-year-olds.
Gentlemen, if I could have your attention, she said, we'd like to discuss some organizational matters.
The hall quieted as Betty took a position at the front. She had a teacher's voice that could cut through any noise.
As you all know, these are uncertain times. We've heard troubling reports from other communities, and we've seen an increase in strangers passing through our area. While we don't want to be unwelcoming to those genuinely in need, we also have a responsibility to protect our families and neighbors.
Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. To that end, we propose establishing some basic security measures. Nothing elaborate, good neighbors looking out for each other, the way we always have. Norm noticed most people were nodding. Peg, who preached about helping everyone, looked solemn. He knew her well enough to read the concern on her face. She would want to help, exactly as she had with the two girls in their field that morning. She always assumed the best of people until they proved otherwise. But even she knew this was different. Too many stories warned them that not everyone was trustworthy. With the way things were now, the danger was impossible to ignore. Betty continued.
We're thinking about patrol schedules, communication protocols, and perhaps some basic supply sharing for those who might need it. Doc has volunteered to coordinate.
The front windows exploded inward.
Glass showered the room as masked figures poured through the openings. Norm's mind registered details in the frozen moment before chaos erupted. Camouflage clothing, semi-automatic weapons, multiple attackers. "Get down!" someone screamed.
Norm dove sideways, knocking Peg behind an overturned table as gunfire erupted. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, rifle cracks mixing with the deeper boom of shotguns and the sharp bark of pistols. A child was crying. Orders rang out, but the confusion muffled them. He pulled his .45 from its holster, Peg's .40 cal already in her hand beside him.
One of the attackers rushed past their table, weapons sweeping left and right. Norm rose and put 2 rounds center mass, watching the man crumple. No time to think about it. No time for anything but survival.
Norm, Pig pointed toward the back corner, where several children huddled with their mothers. An attacker was advancing on them, rifle raised. Norm didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the room, using overturned tables for cover, Peg right behind him. The attacker turned at the sound of running footsteps, and Norm put a bullet in his chest before the man could bring his weapon to bear. The firefight lasted 2 minutes, if that, though it felt like hours. When the shooting stopped, Norm's ears were ringing, and the air was thick with gun smoke. Bodies lay scattered across the hall floor. Attackers and defenders both. Norm did a quick count. 4 attackers down. On their side, a neighbor sat against a wall, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Another wasn't moving, and Norm could see it was bad. Doc dropped beside his neighbor, pressing hands against a chest wound that was bubbling pink. Peg was already moving to help. Her hands were steady as she pulled a tablecloth apart to make bandages. Norm moved through the room, checking on people, making sure the attackers were truly down. He turned one of them over, pushing the mask aside and scanning his face for recognition, but couldn't be certain he knew him. Possibly someone from one of the nearby towns. Someone he'd seen at the gas station in Shoshone or the grocery store in Riverton, but he couldn't say for certain. "Recognize him?" Scott Miller asked as he knelt next to another one of the bandits. "Not for certain. You?" "I think he's a Parker. Remember the old man? This might be his grandson. Heard he got himself into some trouble with drugs." "Drugs? What's that got to do with us?" Norm gestured around the Grange. "Hard tellin'." Scott shrugged. "Might have got a wild hair and thought they could cause some trouble. Don't know who the other 3 are. Strangers, I think." At the shattered windows, Norm leaned out for a careful look. He didn't spot any more attackers. They had fled, but they could return with reinforcements. Wild hair or not, they meant business. "We need to get ready for another attack," he called out. "Already on it," one of the men replied. He and several others were dragging tables and chairs to provide a spot for concealment. "Bill's gone to his truck to use his CB. See if we can get some help." Norm helped Peg tend the wounded while others secured the hall. The shoulder wound looked painful but not life-threatening. The other man was in worse shape, unconscious and losing blood fast despite their efforts. "We need to get him to the hospital in Riverton," Doc said. His training pressed into service. "Roads might not be safe." Norm replied. "The ones that got away, they could be back or warn others, even set up an ambush." Peg looked up from where she knelt beside the man. "We make the roads safe. We escort him ourselves." Norm met her eyes and saw the steel he had always known lay beneath her gentle exterior. Around the room, neighbors checked weapons, shared out ammunition, and readied themselves for whatever might come next. He swallowed hard. His only desire was to get Peg back home where she was protected, but the thought brought a sinking weight to his chest. Alone on their farm, they would be sitting ducks. He could not protect his bride from a group of armed men by himself. Peg was no delicate flower and would do her part, but 2 against half a dozen or more was no fight they could win. His shoulders sagged. Things had to change. Banding together was no longer a choice. It was survival. He thought of the stories they had already heard, of clogged roads and camps bursting at the seams and travelers moving through like a swarm of locusts, stripping away whatever they touched. That tide would reach them sooner or later. If they wanted to survive, the little community would have to stand together, stronger than any single farm or family could on its own. Norm called out to the woman who was helping comfort the children. "You still want to get organized?" She looked up, her gray hair disheveled, but her eyes fierce. "Organ-ever." Norm nodded. These weren't city folk who would fold at the first sign of trouble. These were Wyoming people, and they would stand together no matter what came. His mind drifted to the 2 sisters walking across the pasture that morning, and he hoped they would find the same strength as they made their way to their folks' place. Out here, grit and neighbors willing to stand shoulder to shoulder were the only things that gave a person a fighting chance. "All right then," he said, chambering a fresh round in his .45. "Let's get organized." Outside, engines rumbled in the distance, growing closer. Norm stepped to the window and raised his weapon, the floorboards creaking under his weight as he positioned himself behind the bullet-riddled frame. His knuckles were white against the grip, and he could feel his heartbeat in his throat. Through the jagged glass, dust clouds kicked up from the gravel road. But his grip eased only when a familiar diesel pickup came into view, followed by the volunteer fire department's rescue truck. "It's help," he called out, relief flooding through him. The tension in his shoulders released, and he heard several people behind him let out shaky breaths and murmur words of thankfulness.
Heard about the shooting on Bill's CB. Everyone all right? The driver called as he shut off his diesel pickup. Not everyone, Norm replied. His voice carried the weight of what they'd just endured, rougher than usual. We've got wounded needing transport to Riverton, dead attackers, so we'd better get the sheriff out here too. Good luck with that. He scoffed. The sheriff has too much on his plate. As neighbors helped load the injured into the rescue truck, Norm surveyed the hall. Broken glass crunched under his boots. Bullet holes scarred the walls. Peg appeared at his side, wiping blood from her hands with a torn tablecloth. Think they'll be back? Norm looked at the 4 bodies of their attackers, then at his armed neighbors securing the building. They might, but they'll find us ready. He turned to face her. We need to rethink things. Find ways to band together better. Secure all the farms and ranches. I was thinking the same thing. She nodded, her eyes scanning the damage with the calculating look of someone already making lists in her head. For those men to attack us here, in broad daylight like that, they had to know we'd be armed, right? What's to stop them from doing the same at our place? Taking our cattle, our chickens. They could take everything we've worked to build. Everything your parents worked to build. His mouth went into a tight line as he squared his shoulders. We're going to need a few more people. Peg glanced toward the family renting Smitty's place. I have a few ideas. Betty Miller was already organizing cleanup crews, and Scott was setting up a radio schedule for regular check-ins. The community that had gathered for a potluck had faced the first surge and found its footing together. Norm wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders and looked around at his neighbors, bloodied but unbroken, scared but determined. Reckon I was wrong about not meeting to organize, he admitted. The words came easier than he'd expected, maybe because nearly dying had a way of making a man honest. Next time we'll have people standing watch. Nobody will catch us off guard again. We need a plan to protect the farms and ranches, get everyone working together, and set up sentries. Doc'll know exactly what we need. He watched the former soldier climb into the bed of the pickup truck. Doc would ride to the hospital with the injured, and then come back to help the community, his family. Peg managed a tired smile. There's my practical husband. The Grange Hall would need repairs, new windows, and fresh paint to cover the bullet holes. The old building had weathered blizzards and drought, neighborhood suppers and children's plays, but this was different. It was proof that the world outside their small community had become dangerous in ways they were only beginning to grasp. Still, it would continue to serve its purpose, bringing people together in times of need. Some traditions, Norm thought, as he picked up a spent brass casing and turned it over in his poem, were worth fighting for. The threat beyond their land moved like a swarm of locusts, but here, at least, they would stand together.
This has been Like a Storm of Locusts, a Havoc in Wyoming short story by Millie Copper, produced by CU Publishing LLC and presented by Killer Cozies. Learn more about Millie Copper's books at milliecopper.com.